Welcome back to Creative Quilting the K-Way. We're now on episode 4. We've talked about ripping fabric. Now it's time to learn about cutting fabric. How do we do it accurately? And do we need to be careful? Is it something we need to be accurate with? And the answer, of course, is yes. So how do we do it? Well, let me show you the goal first before we learn how to do it. If we take a look at this black strip here and we line it up on our cutting mat, we can see that it is perfectly lined up and straight. It doesn't waver, it doesn't shift, it doesn't move. That's the goal, to have a nice straight strip going all the way down, okay? We'll learn how to do that. This one, not so good. So let's learn what we don't want to have. If I line it up with that same line on my cutting mat, I can see that I've got a wave. That's not going to work. That's not going to make for an accurate quilt, okay? This wave is going to be too much of a variation in the piecing, and it will shift and give us a little wrinkle in our quilt. It's not going to work out well. So we want to learn how to cut and not have this happen. So what are the tools we need for that? We need a cutting mat, one where you can easily read all the markings. We need rotary cutters, nice sharp ones, right? We need replacement blades. They aren't that expensive and they save wear and tear on your arm. So have replacement blades so you don't get stuck in the middle of a project and start pushing too hard on your fabric, because then things will shift around. You also need some good rulers, rulers that you're comfortable with, that you can read the measurements on. Short ones, long ones, they're both going to work. We'll just use them differently, okay? So let's get a piece of fabric here. This is the bolt that I started with, and it can be easier to take some off and rip some off. Start with a section if you're dealing from a bolt. Usually we're buying yardages from the quilt shop or wherever we get it, and we don't have a huge bolt to deal with. But when I'm dealing with the bolt, I'm going to rip some off to start from. I'm going to put my selvage edges together right here. Line them up. Now on this particular piece of fabric, I already ripped one edge so that I know that it is straight, okay? I'm going to then line up my selvages. I can see from the back here, and I think you can probably see from the front too, that there's going to be a slight problem. If I look at this at the bottom, there's a ripple. That means that this is not laying straight, okay? It means that when this fabric was manufactured and it got wound up on the bolt, it got skewed a little bit. So instead of being a nice square, it's a parallelogram, okay? We talked about this in one of the earlier episodes. One thing we can do for that is we can stretch fabric on the bias to try and get it square. So I'm going to give it a little stretch, see if that helps. Then I'm going to line up my selvages again. That didn't do it, did it? We can still see that ripple going across, which means it's not going to lay straight. What we need to do for that is put our fingers in between the two layers of fabric, and we're going to shimmy it until it's straight. And there's no crinkle or ripple down in the bottom. Now we're going to lay nice and flat. You don't want to do a lot of shifting and pushing. Once you get that straight, you want to just lay it down on the cutting mat. If I want to use my shorty ruler, I'm going to bring up my selvage edges up to the fold and get ready to cut it like that. So I can use my short ruler. I'm going to line up some dotted lines on the top of my ruler with the top of the fabric. I'm going to check the bottom lines and the fold and make sure it's staying nice and square on there. And then I'm going to clean up one edge and get it straight. So I'm going to shift down here. I'm going to check for all the layers to make sure I'm cutting back far enough. And then I'm going to get a nice square edge. I'm going to put a few fingers on the ruler, couple off, and go straight up with that. I don't want to angle my blade this way or angle it this way. As you can see, that adjusts the cut. It's not going to cut well if you angle this way. You want to go straight up and down with nice steady pressure right along. You can see when I angled it, didn't get a nice clean cut. So I'll show you that again. Keep your blade straight up and down, and you'll get a beautiful clean cut. Now, if I was dealing with a smaller piece of yard goods and I was on one of my rotating mats, I would just flip my mat around. I'm just going to flip my fabric. Now you notice that I'm not using the markings on the mat for this type of cutting. We're going to use those for a different type of cutting, but not this. I'm going to use the markings on my ruler for this. So I want to cut a 2.5 inch strip. 1, 2.5. I'm going to line up my ruler, the dotted line, just inside that edge. Just inside. If I put it right on the edge and I cut, I'm going to be a little shy of 2.5 inches, and I want to make sure that I have a good true 2.5 inch strip. So I'm going to line it up on that edge, put some fingers on, a little pressure down on my ruler, and make a nice cut. Just to be sure I'm cutting straight, I always like to check that first strip. So I'm going to open it up and do what I did on those sample pieces and lay it down next to a line on the mat. Looks pretty well lined up. So I know that I've got a good true strip here. So I could continue to cut some. Now if I needed to cut this whole piece of fabric, I might cut a few more, but then I'm going to check that strip again just to make sure nothing's shifted or moved. I've got this lined up on 2.5, just inside the edge. My rotary cutter is going up nice and straight, firm pressure down, cutting another strip. And I'll cut a few more. Line up that dotted line just inside the edge, fingers down on the mat and the ruler, and a nice straight cut. Now I want to show you another way to cut this with a longer ruler, okay? So let's say that makes us a little uncomfortable and we're not quite sure we're going to get it true and square. Let's go back to where we straightened our fabric up. Make sure we're nice and straight, and we're going to lay the full width of the fabric down. Because I shifted and moved things, I'm not going to trust this cut edge. I'm going to take a generous 2.5 and then I'll flip it around and cut the other side. I'm going to line up markings at the bottom on the fold as I did before, and I'm going to line up a line on the top of the fabric. I'm going to cut the full width that way. Flip it around. This time, to make sure I'm laying it straight, I'm just going to line it up with the mat edge, but I'm still using the ruler lines to cut. So putting it on the 2.5 mark, just inside the edge of my fabric, just inside there. And I'll cut that the whole width of the fabric. Either way of cutting those is just fine, whichever one you're more comfortable with. And remember, I use the ruler markings to cut those straight strips, not the mat. If you remember from an earlier episode, this is one that we tried to rip and it didn't work well. So we're going to clean up that edge and we're going to cut some strips from it. So this was that edge that we didn't like when we ripped it. So let's square that up. I'm going to put my fingers in between the two layers, line up those edges, and then check for a ripple in the bottom. I want to make sure it stays nice and straight. Now, in this particular instance, there's a pretty strong crease there from where it was folded on the bolt. You might like to go to your ironing board and press that crease out. So let's give that a little press so we can see what's happening better when we go to cut. And we'll be able to shimmy it and make sure it's straight. Let's try that again now. Put our fingers in between the two selvages and make sure we don't have a ripple or a fold. Just to remind you what that looks like, this would mean it isn't straight. We see that fold down there. Of course, that's a gross exaggeration, but I wanted you to see it. So we'll shift it back till it's nice and straight. Lay it down, and if you're comfortable, bring the edges right up to it, making sure you stay nice and flat. This time, let's cut a 5-inch strip. So I'm going to leave the excess over on the side so I can square it up that edge later. Line up the cut line on the top with the fold, making sure that I line up on the bottom as well. And I can see, I want you to see what I see here, that it's sticking out a little bit. I'm not able to get it straight on there, which means I need to refold that because that will not give me a true cut. Try that again. Much better. So now I'll cut that. Now I tried my other rotary cutter. Do you see what happened there? I need a fresh blade. So when you start cutting and you get those little threads that are still in there, it's time to change your blade, okay? Have one ready at all times so you can go ahead and swap it out. And every time you have to recut it, you have the chance of shifting. So you want to use those nice sharp blades. Now let's line up the edge. Remember, I'm lining up the line just inside of my cut edge. Steady pressure down and a straight rotary cutter straight up and down. This is how we're going to cut things. Okay? You're going to take your time. You're going to make sure you have your fabric nice and smooth and flat. Some other options for cutting. I said there are little rotary mats that spin. Sometimes when you're cutting, it can be handy to spin it instead of lifting your fabric up. So that's what this one does. Also, if you have enough room, if you don't have a spinner mat, you could spin your whole mat as well. The less you mess around with your fabric, the more accurate your cuts are going to be. So you get it smooth, you place it there, and go ahead and cut. That's all there is to cutting accurately. Taking your time, using a good sharp blade, using rulers that you can read the measurements from. So it's time, once again, for things I've learned today. And the thing that I've learned today is straighten twice, cut once. Remember, you are exactly where you should be. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.